On August 27, 1883, something happened that shouldn't have been possible. An explosion was so powerful that its sound traveled thousands of miles across the earth. People hundreds of miles away thought they were hearing cannons. But this wasn't a war, it wasn't a bomb, it was a volcano. And what happened next would kill tens of thousands of people, change the Earth's climate, and create what may have been the loudest sound in human history. Krakatoa was a volcanic island located in the Sunda Strait between the Indonesian islands of Java and Sumatra. For centuries, the volcano had remained relatively quiet. But in May of 1883, everything changed. Small explosions began coming from the island. At first, they seemed like little more than the usual warning signs of an active volcano. Then the eruptions became stronger. Ash began rising into the sky. Smoke could be seen from miles away. Explosions became more frequent, and the entire island seemed to be coming alive. By August, Krakatoa was no longer simply erupting. It was building towards something catastrophic. On August 26th, enormous explosions shook the region. Ships passing through the Sunda Strait reported hearing violent blasts, while ash and volcanic debris began covering the surrounding areas. Then, on the morning of August 27th, Krakatoa reached its breaking point. Four enormous explosions tore through the volcano. The final one was the most powerful. It was so violent that a huge portion of the island was destroyed, sending an enormous column of ash and volcanic material high into the atmosphere. But the explosion itself was only the beginning. Because what Krakatoa unleashed next would travel far beyond Indonesia. It would cross oceans, shake the atmosphere, trigger enormous tsunamis, and produce a sound that would be heard thousands of miles away. But Krakatoa wasn't just a massive volcanic eruption. It may have produced the loudest sound ever heard by humans. The explosion was so powerful that scientists estimate it reached around 310 decibels near the source. To understand just how extreme that is, here's how Krakatoa compares with some familiar sounds. A normal conversation is around 65 decibels. The launch of a Saturn V rocket reached roughly 200 decibels near the source. And Krakatoa? An estimated 310 decibels. But here's where things get truly unbelievable. The most remarkable evidence of Krakatoa's acoustic power isn't actually the estimated decibel level. It's how far the sound traveled. More than 3,000 kilometers away, in Perth, Australia, people clearly heard the explosions. Residents described the sound as resembling distant artillery fire. Some even formed search parties, believing that ships nearby were in distress. But the sound traveled even farther. Around 4,800 kilometers away, on the island of Rodriguez in the Indian Ocean, British colonial officials recorded hearing what they described as the distant roar of heavy guns. They initially believed a naval battle was taking place somewhere far out at sea. Think about that. A volcano in Indonesia had produced an explosion loud enough to be mistaken for artillery thousands of kilometers away. And the sound wasn't simply something people heard. Near the volcano, the pressure wave became physically destructive. Around 65 kilometers from Krakatoa, the British ship Norham Castle was sailing through the Sunda Strait when the final explosions occurred. The captain recorded that the blasts were so violent that the eardrums of more than half of his crew were ruptured. He even believed that the end of the world had arrived. The captain and his crew survived, and the ship itself remained intact. But the explosion had done something extraordinary. It had turned sound itself into a weapon, and this was only the beginning. Because Krakatoa didn't just create an enormous sound wave, it created a pressure wave powerful enough to travel around the planet. But the sound wasn't the most destructive thing Krakatoa produced. The explosion triggered something far more deadly, a massive tsunami. When the volcano collapsed, enormous amounts of rock and seawater were suddenly displaced. The result was a wall of water that raced across the Strait. In some locations, the waves reached around 40 meters above sea level. That's roughly the height of a 13-story building. And there was almost no warning. The waves slammed into the coastlines of Java and Sumatra, destroying everything in their path. Entire villages disappeared beneath the water, and enormous pieces of coral, some weighing hundreds of tons, were carried onto land by the force of the waves. By the time the tsunami was over, around 36,000 people had died, and approximately 165 coastal villages had been destroyed. But Krakatoa's tsunami didn't just affect the immediate area. Changes in sea level were recorded by tide gauges more than 7,000 kilometers away. The ocean itself had felt the explosion, and yet Krakatoa's impact was about to become much larger. Krakatoa had already devastated islands, destroyed villages, and sent a sound wave across thousands of miles. But its effects didn't stop at the ocean. The eruption had punched enormous amounts of volcanic material high into the atmosphere. Around 20 cubic kilometers of ash and pumice were blasted into the sky. But the most important material wasn't the ash, it was sulfur dioxide. High in the atmosphere, sulfur dioxide reacted to form tiny particles called aerosols, and these particles spread around the planet, reflecting some of the sunlight back into space. The result, the average global temperature dropped by roughly 1.2 degrees Celsius the following year. One volcano had temporarily changed the climate of the entire planet. But there was another, much stranger consequence. The atmosphere itself had become a giant canvas. Across Europe, North America, and other parts of the world, people began noticing something unusual in the sky. Sunsets became intensely red, orange, and sometimes almost blood-colored. The volcanic aerosols scattered sunlight in unusual ways, creating spectacular colors that could be seen thousands of miles from Indonesia. People didn't know what was happening. They were watching the aftermath of a volcano on the other side of the planet. And there's even a famous painting that may have been influenced by these strange skies. In 1893, Norwegian artist Edvard Munch painted The Scream. The background contains an intense red-orange sky. Some researchers have suggested that Munch may have been inspired by the spectacular sunsets that followed Krakatoa's eruption. Krakatoa had turned a catastrophe into something that could be seen across the planet. But the most shocking part was still waiting in the middle of the ocean, because the island that had caused all of this was almost gone. Before the eruption, Krakatoa was an island roughly 9 kilometers long and 5 kilometers wide. After the final explosions, much of it simply disappeared. Decades later, a new volcanic island began rising from the same region. It was given a name that literally means child of Krakatoa, Anak Krakatau, and it would prove that Krakatoa's story wasn't over. The volcano had destroyed an island, but it had left behind something that could rise again. You might think that after an eruption like that, Krakatoa was finally dead. It wasn't. Today, a new volcano is rising from the same volcanic system that destroyed the original island. Its name is Anak Krakatau. In Indonesian, that means child of Krakatoa. The real question is, how long until the next chapter begins? In 1883, Krakatoa reminded humanity of something we often forget. We like to believe that we control the world around us. We build cities, we cross oceans, we create machines capable of reaching space. But beneath our feet, the planet is still moving. One volcano was enough to send a sound wave around the world, raise walls of water taller than buildings, darken the atmosphere, and change global temperatures. And one day, long after everyone alive today is gone, the Earth will do what it has always done. It will erupt, and when it does, we'll be reminded once again that we don't live on a quiet planet. We live on a restless one.